Everyone, my name is Ria Colavilla, and I'll be discussing Agent Orange and taking the environmental injustice approach during and after the Vietnam War. When most students and people in general think about the Vietnam War, they usually think about combat, protests, or American soldiers. But what interested me more was what continued after the war officially ended in April 1975. Because for millions of Vietnamese civilians, the negative effects of the war never really stopped. For this project, I'm mainly speaking to American students who probably already know the basic history of the Vietnam War, but maybe haven't given enough thought about it. They haven't given enough thought about the environmental and in general generational impacts of it. And so I wanted to focus on the gap in recognition because I wanted to focus on it between the American and Vietnamese experiences with Agent Orange. Because I also think that that's where the issue becomes more than just historical, as it also becomes political and ethical as well. So, to start off, what is Agent Orange? Agent Orange was a chemical herbicide used by the US military between 1961 and 1971 during Operation Ranch Hand. Its purpose was to destroy forests and crops that could provide cover or food during the war, and around 19 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed across Vietnam. But Agent Orange contained dioxin, which is an extremely toxic chemical that stays in soil, water, and food systems for long periods of time. And so this is important because it affects generationally too. And then this is also where Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence becomes important. What I think is interesting is that Nixon doesn't mention violence or explosions as immediate destruction. He talks about this form of environmental violence and how it happens gradually and quietly, so slowly that people stop really noticing it. And I think Agent Orange fits that idea in such an unsettling way. The environmental damage from Agent Orange spread far beyond the original military attacks during the Vietnam War. Forests across Vietnam were heavily sprayed and stripped of vegetation during Operation Ranch Hand, and then toxic dioxin chemicals remained in the soil and water containing it contaminated crops and rivers that civilians in Vietnam depended on every day. And so over time, exposure moved from the environment to health, such as increasing cancers and birth defects that affected people who lived through the war as well. And so this slide kind of visualizes that process. You can see the effects move from environmental destruction into human health impacts over time. And honestly, I think this is the part of why Agent Orange became easier for the world to distance itself from. Burned forests are visible. A child born decades later with disabilities feels more disconnected in people's minds, even though it comes from the same source. And so I didn't want this project to only be a historical timeline, but some context would also be awesome. And so during Operation Ranch Hand, herbicides were sprayed throughout Vietnam on an enormous scale. And so entire agricultural regions and ecosystems were damaged across the country. And what interested me more was whose suffering became publicly recognized afterwards. And so this brings me to comparison and how we have the comparison section here. In the US, veterans exposed to Agent Orange eventually received official recognition through the Agent Orange Act of 1991, along with healthcare support and compensation. But Vietnamese civilians experienced much less international recognition despite widespread exposure. And this is where I think the environmental justice aspect becomes really important. Because the issue is not simply that harm has occurred, it's that some victims became politically visible while others remained largely invisible to the global public. And so around 3 million Vietnamese people have been reportedly been affected by Agent Orange exposure, including multiple generations born after the war. So the unequal visibility of suffering becomes part of the violence itself. At first, I approached Nixon's theory pretty generally, but while revising my project, I started to think more about visibility and recognition. I don't think Agent Orange is only an example of slow violence because the damage lasted a very long time. But I do think it's an example because acknowledgement itself happened unevenly. And so the suffering only became fully real politically when certain groups were recognized by the media or the government. I think that complicates Nixon's argument in an important way. Violence is not just invisible because it's slow. Sometimes it stays invisible because societies choose not to center certain victims. And in this case, it would be the Vietnamese civilians. And so this all ties back to why does this idea of Agent Orange matter at the end, right? And so specifically, we have the organizations like VAVA to continue to support affected families through medical care and advocacy as well. And I think that this shows this issue is not only historical, but it's ongoing. You know, you have all of these citizens, the civilians in the past, like overall couple decades suffering, and they're still suffering. So I thought this project became less about revisiting the Vietnam War and about combat and more about asking ourselves, oh, what is the environmental injustice part of it? And how has environmental harm been brought up throughout this specific event, you know? And so that is understanding who gets remembered and whose suffering becomes normalized or ignored over time. And so that kind of concludes this specific presentation. I have my sources here, and I would like to thank you very much.